MSG, monosodium glutamate. You've definitely heard of it, right? It's got to be one of the most controversial ingredients on the entire planet. For decades, it's been blamed for just about everything. Headaches, health scares, you name it. But is any of that actually true? All right, let's dive in and find out what the science really has to say. Well, to get to the bottom of this, we have to trace MSG all the way back to its very beginning.
That's right. You might be picturing some sterile lab with bubbling beakers, but nope. The journey of modern MSG doesn't start there. It starts right here, in a field, with a pretty humble root vegetable that's a staple food for millions of people all over the world.
So how in the world do you get from this plant to that white crystalline powder we know as MSG? Well, the first part of the process is actually pretty straightforward. It's all about agriculture and some basic processing.
Okay, so this is our starting point, cassava, and it is packed with starch, which, is basically just a long chain of sugar molecules. This super high starch content makes it the absolute perfect ingredient for what's about to happen next.
The process is pretty simple, really. Farmers pull the roots from the ground, they're taken to a factory, and the starch gets washed out and collected. Then, that starch is broken down. It's a process called hydrolysis into its simplest form, glucose. And just like that, we have the fuel for our main event.
All right, so from the field, we head into the factory. This is where that simple glucose gets transformed into something way more complex and flavorful. And it happens using a process that's probably a lot more familiar than you think.
You know, the word fermentation can sound kind of chemical and industrial, but it's a completely natural process. We're just using microbes to turn one thing into another. Think about it, it's the exact same idea that lets bacteria turn milk into yogurt or yeast to turn grain into beer. In this case, we're just using it to create flavor.
So here's the play-by-play of what happens inside these big tanks called bioreactors. First, that glucose syrup is fed to some very specific bacteria. These tiny microbes just munch away on the sugar, and as a waste product, they produce glutamic acid. From there, that acid is filtered out, it gets stabilized with sodium, which turns it into monosodium glutamate, and finally, it's crystallized into pure MSG.
And the result you get at the end of this whole meticulous process is an incredibly pure product. I mean, look at that number, 99% pure. This isn't some vague mixture of chemicals. It's a single, highly refined compound.
Okay, but why? Why go through all this trouble just to make glutamic acid in the first place? Well, for that answer, we have to go back over a century, to a discovery that completely changed how we think about taste itself. For the longest time, we only recognized 4 basic tastes, right? Sweet, sour, salty, and bitter. But there was this other taste that didn't quite fit, that deep, savory, mouth-watering flavor you get from things like a good broth or aged cheese or seared meat. Well, that taste is umami, and its source is glutamate. And this is the man who finally cracked the code. Back in 1907, a Japanese chemist, Professor Kikunai Ikeda, was eating a bowl of seaweed broth that his wife made, and he just became obsessed with figuring out what made it so uniquely savory. And just a year later, he did it. He managed to isolate the exact compound responsible for that amazing flavor, glutamic acid. He knew right away that this was a huge deal, so he patented a way to mass produce it and started selling it under the name Ajinomoto, which means essence of taste. How cool is that? Okay, now this is the crucial point, so listen up. The glutamate in that factory-made MSG is chemically identical to the glutamate you find naturally in foods we eat all the time. Your tongue literally cannot tell the difference between the glutamate from a ripe tomato and the glutamate from a shaker of MSG, because there is no difference.
And that industrial process that Ikeda pioneered, wow, it has become a massive global industry. Just take a major cassava-producing country like Thailand. Nearly a fifth of all their cassava starch goes towards making MSG for the global market. It's a huge business, all built on that one single savory taste.
Okay, so we've seen how it's made, we know where it came from. Now, let's circle all the way back to our original question. Is it actually bad for you? Well, this is where things get complicated. So on one side of the scale, you have the major global food regulators. The FDA calls MSG generally recognized as safe. The World Health Organization agrees. For decades, study after study has failed to find a definite link between eating normal amounts of MSG and any bad health effects. But on the other side, the public controversy just keeps going. Some people report symptoms like headaches after eating foods with MSG. And while science hasn't been able to consistently prove these effects in controlled studies, those personal experiences are exactly what keeps this debate alive. So where does that leave us? We've got a flavor enhancer that was first discovered in a natural seaweed broth, but is now made through a modern fermentation process that starts with a simple vegetable. The world's top health organizations say it's safe, and yet this cloud of suspicion still hangs around. So, knowing the whole journey, from a cassava root to a crystal of pure umami, you've got to ask yourself, does it change how you see flavor? What really defines a natural flavor versus an artificial one? And where do you draw the line?